Okay, I'm all set. We're getting a few students in here. Everybody's surviving the hurricanes down south, I gather. I have some students, well, quite often I have students at Ole Miss that are down even lower in the state, and they get knocked out for about a week during the various storms. We got 2 minutes to start. We'll see who else shows up here. We have one student that's in New Zealand taking the class. I don't know if he shows up or just watches the recordings, but
gotcha.
We'll see how that goes. Are you still living across the street from me there at is it Shawnee?
Yeah, where are you at?
Are you in Jackson?
Yeah, I'm still at Sarah's old house. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'm across the road on Donna Drive.
Oh, okay, I gotcha. Yeah, we love it here.
Great. Well, we liked it because it was so close.
Yeah, it's a perfect family home for us.
Excellent.
All the kiddos have plenty of room to spread out there, so.
I'll let Tim and Sarah know that.
Yeah.
Okay, we are recording, so enough of this talk about where we live. That's crazy. Darren, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm Darren Tipton. I'm a district administrator with Missouri Probation and Parole in Cape Girardeau. Glad to join you all this evening at Randy's invitation.
Talk a little bit about your background, education background for the job, and if you've pursued it even further.
Yeah, my education started at Southeast Missouri State, and I actually did an internship at Randy's juvenile office way back in the 90s. So I think that was about 97, 96, 97, something like that. Interned at his office, but my real passion was with adult probation and parole, and had an opportunity to join the state of Missouri in 1999. So got about 21 years with the state of Missouri. I started as a probation and parole officer in the Boot Hill, and served as a unit supervisor for a couple of years, and I've been a district administrator for about 13 years now. So the way our offices are set up around the state, we have about 35 districts. Ours serves 3 counties, about 1,500 offenders that we supervise in those 3 counties, much of it pretty rural and limited resources. And we have 24 officers that serve in those 3 counties for us. So we do court services. Our officers work out of court, signing up offenders when they're placed on supervision, testifying as needed for revocation hearings. And then we serve the parole board in Missouri also. So Missouri is a dual system that we do our state probation and parole under one agency, which falls under Department of Corrections. So we're getting offenders released from prison, every day, men and women. We supervise felonies, of course, for those coming out of prisons, and then all felonies and some misdemeanors for probation cases in Missouri.
When you say court services, kind of explain to them, what's the first stop or the first time you would actually see a client?
The first time we see a client normally is when a sentencing assessment report is ordered by the court. And so that's basically a background investigation on the client. So we go in depth looking at their criminal history, just really how did they get here? What was circumstances of the offense? What do they have to say about it? Gather a lot of information that otherwise the court would not have. Generally a client's going in front of the court and the attorneys introduce the information they want, but that's not necessarily everything the court would want to know to have good sentencing. So we usually spend about 3 weeks from the time the court orders that, meeting with the client, their family. We've had a large focus in the last few years on actually working on case planning and what's that client going to do if they're placed on supervision. Because as you can imagine, the majority of clients or defendants who go in front of the court and plead guilty do end up on community supervision instead of going to prison. So we don't make recommendations any longer. That's something, 20 years ago, we did make recommendations to the court. We don't do that any longer. We just give the court the information and let them make the decision on it. So that's our first touch with the client, is assessing them, or they can waive that option and be placed directly on probation. A lot of times, there'll be a plea agreement in place, and maybe it's a first-time offender who's never been in trouble before, and for a relatively minor felony. And so there'll be a plea agreement, and they'll come directly to us without us knowing anything about them at that time. But we have officers that work court, and they're sitting right there when they're placed on supervision or when that assessment's ordered.
How did that, are you doing a risk assessment then, right? After they get placed with you?
We're doing a risk assessment. Traditionally, we've done that after they're placed on supervision. But in 2019, we started doing those assessments during the sentencing assessment phase also. So we have a pre-trial type tool that we can use, a pre-sentencing tool. We're using the Ohio risk assessment system now. We just adopted that in the last couple of years. And so it has different modules. It has a prison intake tool. It has a reentry tool. So those are used inside the prison when a person first gets there or prior to release. And then in the community, we have a community supervision tool that we use. And depending on how long the person's been in custody, that we could use those other tools in the field too, because it's more applicable to people that have been incarcerated for a while. But regardless of which tool we use, we use this. It's a validated tool from University of Cincinnati, Ohio. And it's validated across several states, and our data is constantly fed into their system to revalidate that. So it's not, we used to have like a gender-specific tool for females. We had a homegrown assessment tool that we used, but they were only validated to Missouri. And we saw that those became obsolete because we just didn't have the volume of data that we would have when we joined a congregate like that. So yes, we're actually doing those assessments, and we're able to tell the courts during the sentencing assessment phase that these are the risk factors, these are the barriers, and here's a sort of a plan that would work well if the offender chose to follow it. So,
does Missouri with Department of Corrections have a dashboard where you can go to and actually see how many you supervise and at what level of risk assessment for the public to see?
It's not available to the public right now. We first started using the ORAS manually on paper because there was a big push to get it out quickly. But we have joined Ohio University of Cincinnati's dashboard for our staff. So our staff can access all the scoring. It works between districts if a client moves. And we also do our case planning in there now. But it does have a dashboard that pulls up a map and shows all our offenders, where they're at, where our high risk and very high risk offenders are.
Well, students, that's a new term, dashboard. It's with the data-driven material that's coming in on all clients. And then some states, I know Florida, if you look up the juvenile dashboard in Florida, it'll tell you all kinds of things about the population, what kids are in care, what are in the community, how many are in the detention center, and then outcome data also. So it's really available to the public now. I'm sure there's a personal tool that they can use, that officers can use that shows more. But they're really trying for transparency in these businesses now. So I'm seeing that more and more. I'm sure you are too.
Absolutely. There's a lot of dollars that goes into corrections, as you know. It can be a money pit, and we're held accountable to the taxpayers of where's this money going. We don't get a lot of federal money, and so there's a lot of accountability at the state level for corrections because it sucks up such a huge amount of the state tax dollars. And so we definitely are accountable to where those are going. And unfortunately, most of it is spoken for as soon as it's allocated. We have to feed prisoners, we have to give them medical care. Housing of the offenders, costs the bulk of the money. So there's not always a lot left for community corrections. But if you all have heard the term justice reinvestment, across the nation, that's been a big movement the last several years, are justice reinvestment initiatives, JRIs. And the Council of State Governments is willing to come to states. And so if you read about the Council of State Governments, it's based in Washington, D.C., and they will come to the state, assess its spending in corrections, the results that we're getting in corrections, how we compare to other states, and put us on a roadmap to be more successful and use our money more efficiently. So we focused on that a lot the last couple of years.
Council of State Governments. Who's
I'm
your
sorry?
funder for that? Council of State Governments. Do you know where the money comes
It's federally
from?
funded. It's federally funded, I believe. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's nonpartisan. I believe it's tax based, but contracted out. And so these consultants come really boots on the ground to a state, and they come into our probation and parole offices. They look at the legislative spending. They just from top to bottom will assess. And they're not just based in corrections. They will do that on all different arenas of government spending. But obviously for our purposes, the focus is on corrections and where that money goes from the second it's allocated by the legislature, and how much is spent on, housing prisoners, where our revocation rates outside other states, or, success outside the norm. And then they, with their experience, I think they've worked in 13 different states before they came to us, and they were able to use those experiences in other states and say, this might be successful. This is a money pit you want to avoid. These are policies that need to be changed. And, the idea behind justice reinvestment is that all the tax dollars you can save on incarcerating individuals could be replaced into field community services, treatment, the things that we really need. And we aren't going to get any more money. I think, every state's in the same situation. They're not going to put more money into corrections, but if we could spend it more wisely, they're willing to, keep it budget neutral and give us the same amount of funding, but we reinvest it into something else. So that's been a huge push the last few years.
Well, that just gave us some more terms to look up for these. If we have any students in here that are looking for a good topic, justice reinvestment initiatives would be a really good topic with tons of research articles on it. You say they don't provide a sentence recommendation anymore on the pre-sentence or whatever they're calling it now.
Right.
Do you find there's in our textbook, there's a chapter called the going rate. Do you get surprised sometime, or the judges and the courtroom work group, the prosecutor, the public defender, the attorneys, are they dialed in pretty close when somebody gets a second-degree assault or a robbery? You're pretty much knowing what's going to come out as a sentence?
I'd say to a large degree. Most defendants are first-time offenders, and if it's not a violent offense and you don't have a victim, testifying that they're adamant that they don't want them in the community or there's some community risk, most people are going to get probation for a felony case. So that would be the majority of our cases. And then there's cases that it's very clear they're not going to get probation. Murders, people that were already on parole for some sort of homicide, vehicular homicide, and then they get another DWI. And so they've been put in the community at risk again. Most judges are not going to give them another chance to hurt the community. So the overwhelming majority of cases, I think everyone's, in pretty good alignment with what should happen. The disparity that we still see, though, is the length of sentences. And that really varies from the urban areas typically have shorter sentences, and the rural areas typically, give longer prison sentences. And those are what can really affect incarceration rates. If your state doesn't have some kind of sentencing system in place that releases offenders at a similar rate, regardless of how long their offense is. If you look traditionally, states may say, a first-time offender has to serve 40%, a second-time offender maybe 60% of their sentence. So obviously that could be a huge difference if in the city of St. Louis an offender gets a 1-year sentence, and down here in Cape Girardeau the offender gets a 10-year sentence. They're going to serve a lot different amount of time, even if they're very similar offenders, because they're just minimum sentencing. So that was very popular in the 80s and into the 90s, and even into the early 2000s, with holding people accountable, the get tough on crime era. And that just resulted, those minimum prison sentences resulted in disparities because the judges still had some leeway in it. And we have counties that just have almost filled up prisons themselves because of those long sentences. And so you may have an offender who has a lot of assets but in that area, they're just more conservative and do longer sentences. Whereas an offender who had no assets in the city, gets a 1-year sentence. So we don't see that with probation as much. In Missouri, judges do have the option of probation up to 5 years, 2 to 5 years. The majority of sentences for probation, though, are for 5 years, just a maximum 5-year probation. It's really those prison sentences that are so disparate.
Mm-hmm. And that's still going on then?
It is. It is. The criminal code in Missouri was rewritten a couple of years ago for the first time in 40 years. It was completely overhauled. And so it created a lower class of felony that reduced a lot of prison sentences. So that did take some of that authority away from the judges, because they just took Class D felonies and made them Class E felonies that had a much lower, maximum prison sentence. So we've seen that, but also we've seen a lot of criminal justice reform in Missouri, and of course, across the nation in the last few years. And so between that and some court decisions that have forced the parole boards to take a look at sentencing, we have seen more offenders being released.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the research article that I provided all the students. Got you a copy of it. It basically, with all their statistics, they're talking about family ties and how those would help offenders not recidivate, maybe stay in the community longer, and have more access and more skills to be able to get into the job market. So you said earlier, before we turned on the recording, that you saw that, but you had some other ideas too.
Yeah, and I think the article kind of touched on, it's really hard to measure. I mean, it's hard to measure people. We know that, and there's so many different situations. So family overall definitely, is supportive, but we have so many instances, I think, in this particular subset of citizens who are on probation or coming out of prison on parole that may not have family that's either capable of supporting them or is not supportive of them. A simple way to just look at it is, a lot of reasons people are in trouble is because of the people they hang around with and their environment they've been in. And a lot of times that's their family. So overall, if you have a good family and the family's supportive of you and would provide transportation or are just good examples, a lot of times it's just that, if you have a family who works and does not use drugs and, believes that, they'll support you and get you on your feet, but they're not going to just, keep providing for you while you're not looking for a job, then you're probably not going to make it. And I think the article alluded to that, and that's just really hard to measure. So that's always a challenge for us. Almost every offender, maybe in our district, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, we'll have an offender who literally cannot find a home plan that wants to come to our area. But almost everybody can find somebody that says, yeah, I'll let you come live with me. But to find somebody that says, I understand you're going to need some support for a while, and I'm going to make sure you get to a 12-step meeting. I'm going to make sure you get to see your PO, and I'm going to also hold you accountable for going to look for a job every day. Those families are, really far and few. We do have, some people, as Randy knows, that come from great families and, make bad choices. But we can attribute a lot of, where people are today based on the people they hang around with and their attitudes, which usually comes from either upbringing or the people they've hung around with.
Yeah, my big surprise case last year was, and I don't know if it's crossed your desk yet, but it was the 14-year-old boy that did the armed robbery that shot the victim, the kid in the robbery, in the head, shot him in the back of the head, but he won the lottery and the bullet just kind of bounced off. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it was wet powder or a bad round or the way it glancing blow or whatever, but the victim walked into our office a week later with his own medical reports. So my guys still doing pre-sentence investigation, so we did it. This kid 2 years ago held his brother while he bled out just a block off of Broadway in a big drug deal gone bad, and his brother was defending the mother and got shot. So this is a big criminal family, but this 14-year-old boy, we had him in juvenile court. We recommended that he go into the Division of Youth Service facility until his 18th birthday. The judge overrode us and certified him as an adult. So he's been sitting in jail waiting his court date. So he's going to be in your office pretty soon, probably.
Right. Yep, we'll be interviewing him at jail. Yep.
Yeah, you'll be interviewing him shortly. But, you know, other than that, the going rate works pretty good. But occasionally, for some reason, you'll get these aberrant cases like that. So what about explain on reentry, when we've been focusing on the offender, but I've seen you a lot doing things with the community and outside agencies. If you could explain that focus to my students, I think that'd be real helpful.
Absolutely. About 15 years ago, nobody knew what reentry was. The federal government started a Transition to Communities from Prisons initiative, TCPI initiative, and started dumping some money into states. And this was really one of the first federally funded, really in about 40 years, federally funded effort to start reducing incarceration. We just couldn't keep building prisons. The federal government wasn't going to help us do it. And started saying, well, what's the gap? And all of us practitioners knew the gap was that we're not preparing people for release. They serve their sentence, and when their time's up, they just go back home. And everybody goes back to what they know in general. So there was a real concerted effort to start linking clients with the appropriate services. And out of that, reentry was born. How do we prepare people to reenter society and become productive citizens? The way I like to put it when we do, and I'll talk about in a minute, reentry simulations, is just think today. Today, if you were arrested, how long would you keep your apartment or your house before it was gone? And what would happen with all your belongings you have? What friends would still be around? You know, who would abandon you or who would be there supporting you? And do any of those people that are your friends, do they have enough money to pay your attorney, or do you have enough in savings for that? How long would you keep everything anchored in your community where you're at now? Probably not very long. Most of us wouldn't. Then fast forward to getting a prison sentence, and you go to prison for even a year. What would be left when you get out? Where would you go? So a lot of us probably have good support. You know, we have a mother we could go to, or grandmother, at least have a place to stay. But think about a lot of our inmates and how they landed there. They landed there because they were out on the streets all the time. They landed there because they were hungry, because they didn't have money to meet their basic needs. And those things are still not going to be there when they get out. We have people that maybe had good support, but they serve a 20 or 30 year sentence. There's no family member left alive that they even could go to. And so we were just, we were releasing people into the community, really setting them up to fail. We took a lot of efforts in probation and parole in Missouri and across the United States community corrections agencies, tried to be experts at everything. There was a time we tried to be their counselor, and we tried to teach them, their GED to get their diploma or high set. We just tried to be everything, and we don't have the funding to do that. And we were just kind of amateurs at all of that. While at the same time, there were all kinds of good community services around the state and across the nation that specialize in those things. So why were we trying, for an offender out in the community, why were we trying to educate them when we have an education facility in town? We have treatment facilities. And so we really took a step back and said, probation and parole needs to be a broker to make sure that we're a good referral agent to get people to the right places. And what we saw in the beginning, and it had always been our mindset too, and in the community, the mindset was that it's probation and parole's people. It's their problem. When in reality, people reentering society is a community issue, and it requires a community solution. These are citizens. And so when we take a look at it from that aspect, well, if I dropped out of high school, I could go to GED classes. So why does it matter that I came out of prison? Can I just go to that same GED class? Made total sense, right? But for so long, we worked in silos and didn't bother to look at what everybody else was doing. So So the big component of reentry was just open up communication in communities, and that has to be a grassroots effort. There are some statewide and federal initiatives that can help with that, such things as like memorandums of understanding, just an agreement between agencies, like we have with our Department of Social Services, that says if they're investigating a child abuse case, we can share any information we've got, and they'll let us know they're investigating that. Things like that just used to be in silos, and we would never find out about it. At the federal level, we've gotten permission now for people who are incarcerated to start applying for disability benefits while they're incarcerated in preparation for their release. So used to, you get out and then you could apply for release because you weren't, or apply for Social Security disability benefits. You weren't eligible if you were incarcerated to even apply, even if you were going to get out next month. So right off the bat, we would have people who had disabilities and were not able to work, went to prison, and when they were getting ready to come out, they knew it was going to be at least 4 months before they would start getting any funding back. So it really was a concerted effort with communication between agencies. It did start at the federal and state levels, but when we saw the success is when we took that locally. So for example, now the reentry team that I have in my district is the local, employment office, it's treatment facilities, anybody that we will be referring clients to comes to the table. And a lot of that communication is just like, hey, we've got a grant that funds this, or our waiting list is short, we could get some people in now. It really is just, collaboration and communication. And then, like I say, on the other end of that was preparing offenders for release. So we started having a lot of success just by opening communication in our communities, but that still sets people up for failure if we don't prepare them before they get out. And so we started making a lot of efforts in Missouri, particularly. I believe we were one of 3 states that started with the TCPI initiative, and we started transitional housing units inside prisons. And so as offenders get about 6 months to a year from release, they could apply to move to the transitional housing unit within the prison. And in that housing unit, then they started taking programming and things that were going to be relevant for their release in the community. Employment preparedness classes, dress for success, teaching them this is how you explain your felony during an interview. This is when you show up for an interview on time, dress nicely. A lot of life skills that some people never developed, either because of the environment they grew up in, or they'd spent their whole life in prison and came as kids and are leaving as adults. So we started making a big focus on that, and that ran for quite a while. Then the federal money ran out, but during that time, we also implemented in Missouri community supervision centers. So across Missouri, we have 7 facilities that are sort of like a halfway house when they were first created. They were attached to probation and parole facilities. So that could support people being released, or also support people that had 1 foot back in prison, to give them a chance to get out of their community, stay in a solid place at night, get drug tested, get some programming. And we wanted to take a look at how that would work. So if we fast forward to the last couple of years with reentry, it was funny when Randy, sent this and said, hey, we're going to talk about reentry a little bit. I got to thinking, when's the last time I heard the word reentry? It's been a while, and that's not because it's a bad thing. That's because it's what we do now. It's what we do every day. It's just part of our work. And so it's not a program. So you'll find reentry programs because there are facilities, there are contracted vendors that offer reentry services like housing, helping, people pay their deposit if they rent an apartment, helping pay the utility deposit, helping them get transportation. And so we have a lot of partner agencies that have reentry programs, but reentry itself is not a program. It's a philosophy, and it's a way that you do supervision. And so it's just what we do every day. When I started as a PO in 1999, if I got a notice from the prison that somebody was coming out, I would pretty much contact that, mother or father and say, would you allow him to live here? Okay, good. He can come out. Nowadays, these offenders are getting prepared before they get released. They're giving mental health medications, a 90-day supply when they get out, so that they've got time to get in with a medical provider before they run out of their medications. They're getting, like I said, dress for success or skills classes. They're also talking with their field PO. So before a person even comes out of prison, they've talked, hopefully on a Zoom meeting, with their PO that they're going to have in the community. So some expectations can be relayed and they know who they're going to see when they get out. And we also follow up with that home plan 2 months before, a month before, a week before, to keep them apprised that the release is still on track, and also what concerns they may have. Because a lot of times things would kind of fall apart after we approved a home plan. Maybe that wasn't even really where the offender was planning on going. They may have just made that up. Maybe it was a desperate attempt to just get out of prison. Sometimes we'll have family members just say, yeah, they can come live here. And they really didn't want that to happen, but they're afraid to stand up to the offenders. So those sort of things we just wouldn't know if we only talked to the family one time. So we start trying to develop that relationship with the significant others before the client even gets out. And it's definitely making for a smoother transition. As far as funding, there's not generally funding for reentry specifically now. However, in Missouri, we have what's called an intervention fee, and it's almost like a supervision fee that clients have to pay every month unless they're indigent. And all that funding by state statute has to go back to offender services. So we do use a portion of that each year, usually $1 to $2 million a year, that we reinvest back into communities for reentry funding. So locally, we've had grants for up to $50,000 before that help with, like I said, down payments on or deposits on an apartment. We have bus passes for $30 a month. In one of our local communities, we can provide a bus pass that they can ride unlimited, things like that. What we did find locally was a lot of the barriers that are financial are really small when an offender first comes out. I like to say, it doesn't matter if it costs $10 or $1 million to get an ID card. If you have $0, it doesn't matter. You're broke. So what we found was locally, a lot of the barriers were just that offenders didn't have an ID card or they didn't have a social security card. And so we can guide them through the process of getting a free social security card and a $10 or $12 ID card from the Department of Revenue. And like we have agreements that they'll let us use their offender ID to be able to get their state ID, that, you or I couldn't just walk up with like a school ID and get our driver's license, but they'll let Department of Corrections IDs count as that because they know we verify it. So like I say, some of that's just working out agreements that have smoothed the road for our offenders, and others were, a few resources here and there.
So housing, there are some housing programs, there are some halfway houses. And I've worked with some fathers of kids we have in care, so I know they're out there. I know those are in existence. Are you having anyone from other states come in and look at how you guys run programs, and you go to other states too? Or Crystal here online says she works with a Mississippi reentry program in DeSoto, Tate, and Marshall counties. Crystal, I toured the prison, the private prison in Marshall, what's called the Marshall County Correctional Facility, I think, in Holly Springs. Toured it a couple of years ago and listened to their programs and things they were working. They worked a lot. The inmates went through MRT programs there too. So I don't know. I would think most states have this going on at the same time we are.
Right, I agree.
How is this impacting recidivism rates though? Or is it too early to tell?
It's too early to tell about a lot of it because we've kind of moved the ball. We've become more effective as there's been more and more data come out, and then with the Council of States Governments coming in and giving us more guidance, we're kind of doing a reset on that. There are so many variables, like we kind of talked about earlier, judge sentencing in disparities from rural areas to urban areas. Some crimes we see not even getting prosecuted in some areas, which I know we see that across the country too. And so we have to deal with that. And then, like I said, the disparate sentencing actually levels. And then, like I said, we didn't have the best assessment tool. We've been making good efforts on that, but now we adopted an official assessment tool that's validated. So we're able to really put apples to apples now instead of the way, in the past it's been compared. One question.
Crystal's asked here about jobs for offenders. I think Darren, I guess you are still on it, but I think both of us are on the Workforce Development Board here for this region of the state. And it provides all of the job training, laid off worker training. It has a youth program for people under 24. And they're always seeking clients. There's always room for more. They hate to return dollars, and they usually do return dollars because they don't have enough clients. But they do a really good job with this board that includes all the major manufacturers in our region, and there's good reasons to put inmates to work in those places. I mean, there's benefits for them. There's tax breaks if they put inmates to work. Correct?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of success with employment, and really our biggest barrier is just clients not being employable. They don't have the employment skills or really the life skills a lot of times to be a good employee. And I can tell you 15 years ago, most employers, if you said, hey, I've got a murderer that needs a job, or I've got a thief that needs a job, they wouldn't touch it. The economy's improved, and it's hard to find enough employees. And so I think they got a little more desperate to find employees and are willing to take some risk. But at the same time, that, like Randy alluded to, the federal bonding came in place. And so if you hire someone who is an at-risk offender, so maybe somebody who has served time for burglary, and you hire him and he's going to be handling any money, he can be federally bonded. So there's basically an insurance policy in place that if he were to steal money from you as the employer, that you would get reimbursed. So people were willing to take more risks. That's been very successful. But yeah, we definitely, if an offender wants to have a job, they'll have a job. We have no problems with that. Like you said, we work with major manufacturers. There's a very large food manufacturer about half hour north of us who has, I think they have a total of like maybe 19 plants across the Midwest. But any offender can walk in any day and get a job there. And it's good money, and they provide benefits. We've worked out agreements that they provide transportation. So our offenders can ride back and forth on a van for $50 a week. And we worked out a direct withdrawal, so they'll just take it out of their paycheck. And a lot of offenders, even who have cars, have figured out it's cheaper to do that than to drive their own car back and forth to this factory. And so they ride there and ride back, plenty of overtime. They've put incentives in place for offenders, like for perfect attendance. They'll get, a certain financial incentive, that sort of thing. But we really, last decade.
The big issue is showing up to work.
Right. It's about those life skills. I mean, it really is. You're not going to have a job if you don't show up, and you're not going to have a job if you show up to work by.
You've got a shift. They can't stand to have that machine with nobody on it. Something, a position, or even the computerized systems like at Biokiwa. One guy goes off duty and another one comes in. If he's not there, the other guy's on overtime. That's the same with law enforcement. We're having that problem in our area with police officers just not showing up to work and losing their job. And that's part of the thing. If you're covering a shift, you got to cover it, or the next guy's on overtime.
Right. Yes. A lot of the issues that we see are community issues, but it's just more visible, with our clients. Like you're talking about, we have a problem in our prisons with corrections officers not showing up, or, calling in sick. So having the blue flu you read about, because they have to work so much overtime. They're so worn out. Then they call in, but that only makes it worse for their coworkers. So we deal with that even in, professional situations. So it's not specific. It's not because they're an offender that they're behaving that way. It's a thing that we see in society and in our communities. And it's just a little tougher for an offender to get a job sometimes if they're job hopping versus you or me. And so they start getting the cards stacked against them pretty quickly, especially, if they were dependent on living at mom's, and then mom's tired of them losing their job every other week and can't drag them out of bed, those sort of things. So, we really try to focus on that inside the prisons. We've expanded the THUs, the transitional housing units, to all of our prisons that are not maximum security, because there's very few offenders getting released from those institutions. But all our other prisons have the THUs, and we see, a lot of success for clients coming out of those. There's so much training, heavy equipment operator training and everything inside our facilities now. Clients can either in an institution, or we have one of our community supervision centers now that they can get their CDL and be a truck driver. So there's lots of opportunities for people that want to succeed. Yeah.
Let's talk about diversity in your probation and parole region. What's going on with that, and what are you doing toward recruiting to get a more diverse workforce?
Our area is probably a little unique because we haven't traditionally hired a lot of new probation and parole officers in my district, so it's hard to speak to that to some degree. For until about 3 years ago, the probation and parole officer in our district, who was the latest new hire, has 21 years in. She's got over 25 years now. Just because we're, I guess, one of the more economically advantaged counties in Southeast Missouri. So a lot of people want to live in this area. A lot of our students at the local university, remain in this area after they complete school. And so traditionally, we haven't done a lot of hiring. In the last few years, we've grown quite a bit. So we have had some new hires. But, diversity, we always need diversity. And I don't mean that just about race or anything. Life experiences are really what we need the diversity in the most, regardless of what race, creed, or gender, or anything. We want people that have life experience. That doesn't have to be, personal life experience, and we don't have to hire you because you are in recovery. But maybe you've got a family member and you grew up with it. Maybe you have experienced it yourself. What we see sometimes that people are lacking as they come out of college is just life experience. And if you've had experiences, even in other jobs, and so you've worked with people who didn't show up every day, and you've had to cover those shifts, and you've got some of that life experience that you can convey to an offender, to a client, that definitely will help. We, today there's of course, a huge focus on data. We were just talking about dashboards earlier. Data, everything nowadays is put into a computer system, and we can see, did you make this contact on this date? Did you call this person like you were supposed to? What was said when you talked to them? And so we can measure those things, but what's immeasurable is just being able to have conversations with people. So I would definitely encourage you all to, get any kind of experience with people. Literally a part-time job in a fast food restaurant, working at a library, anything that you can deal with people will give you some good life experiences. It definitely makes a difference when we're interviewing somebody, if they can relate to what our offenders will go through. Definitely.
Right. And they're always looking for help at the GED centers, or the high set is what they call it here. I don't know if that's nationwide new term. It was GED for 100 years. I don't know why that wasn't good enough, but it's high set now.
Yeah, absolutely. Treatment facilities.
Do you speak at all on parole? Is it half of the clients go back to prison, or less, or what do you think?
We were at, I believe we were at about 54% returned within 2 years. And that was not the worst in the nation. We were the eighth. Had the eighth highest incarceration rate at the time we implemented some of these latest measures in the last 3 or 4 years. And we had the highest female prison population rate, like it was growing at the fastest rate. And that's really what spurred, our state government to look at what we could do differently. Because, ultimately when it comes to our, to the capital, it's about money. And we could not afford to build 2 prisons, at $1 billion a piece. By now we would have needed those. And the money's not there. That money did not exist. And so we had to do something. So fortunately, that woke up our legislature about the same time that we got a new director, Ann Presythe, who came from North Carolina and had experience in community corrections, but also is awesome with data, and really looked at what we were spending the money on and what we could do differently. So that rate is decreasing quickly. What we focus on now, is reducing our technical violations. So an offender that's on supervision, we don't want to send them to prison if they're committing technical violations and not committing new law offenses. Obviously, we want to hold them accountable, and if there's public safety issues that come into play, that changes everything. But a high number of about half of our offenders who were going back to prison previously were going back because of technical violations. So that's somebody who maybe didn't report to their PO for a month or two, and then we catch them, and then went back. Somebody who's getting dirty urines and not working, that sort of stuff, not new felonies and all. So those people we want to divert from going back to prison if we have programming in the community. And a lot of the problems that we saw were that there just weren't resources available. People needed to be in treatment, but they were continually on a waiting list. And in the meantime, they were constantly getting dirty urine samples. And so they ran out of options. The PO ran out of options. We had to send them to prison. Well, that just compounded the problem, because if it costs $70 a day to keep somebody incarcerated, I could have put them in treatment for a month or 6 weeks for that in the community. So that's when we talk about justice reinvestment, that's where we really start adding up a lot of dollars quickly. If I can save $70 to $75 a day for every person that's not in prison, I can quickly pay for some programs in the community. So we had to get the legislature on board to say, okay, we'll reinvest the money back into your system, not take the money and use it for, agriculture or social services or whatever. So we've started the JRITPs, the JRI treatment programs, and we started with 3 of those facilities across the state, 3 counties across the state last year, and they're expanding to 3 more this year. But they're spending a little over $1 million per county for treatment services. So instead of like in my county, where before COVID, we had a 6 to 8 month wait to get somebody into outpatient treatment, now there's an outpatient treatment counselor in the facility at the probation and parole office, and they're dedicated to just working with those probation and parole clients.
Here's an unforeseen consequences of the change with probation and parole, because they're really trying to work people through their addictions, which is a super good thing. But when the addiction is meth, well, if they're using meth, the smoke and the tailings from the meth product that they're smoking, and if they smoke in the house or it's around in their house and on the fabric, well, then the kids in the house are testing positive for meth. Then they come into my system. So they're getting, when they get drug tested, which you can't use our drug test, but social services will drug test these adults. And if they're positive, well, then they want the kids tested, and then they come into care. I can guarantee you this one I'm waiting to read tonight after I hang up here is a drug positive kid under 5 years old. If it's not 1, it's 2 or 3 in Bollinger County of that age. And it's just absorbed through the skin. And the drug of choice here is meth. I have a friend who's a police officer in St. Louis, and he says they don't use that hillbilly drug down up here. They use heroin.
Heroin, yeah.
So, but meth has quadrupled my caseload since 2011. And the big impact in our county is we have to provide the guardian ad litems and the attorneys for the parents that are indigent and don't have work or don't meet a certain financial standard. The judge appoints them counsel. Well, we spend $250,000 a year on those attorneys now in Cape County. And so for the last, and it never drops. It's like every year, $250,000 goes out of our budget for treatment. Well, it pays for attorneys for these clients. So it's a horribly complex social issue, guys. So it really impacts us all.
Absolutely.
The better work Darren does, the less work I have to do.
Yeah, and I kind of mentioned earlier reentry simulations, and these are little 1 to 2 hour sessions that we do in the community just to tell people about reentry and why it's important. It's not a sales pitch. We're not asking for anything other than just, an ear to learn about this community issue. And When we start talking about the dollars saved, when we can divert people from prison, if we're not afraid of them, and if they're not, a risk to the community, everybody gets on board. It's
Yeah.
even if you're not sold on this, you don't like, quote, don't like felons or whatever. If you realize, what your tax dollars are doing, Department of Corrections is the largest state government employer in Missouri. And there's a lot of other good that we could be being done if we weren't having to watch people to make sure they stay inside a fence. And there's a lot of people that we're not scared of. They just made really stupid decisions. They do need to repay society. They need to get their life on track, but we don't need to be paying $70 a day. So, I think of college students. I think of, people just starting out on their own. What kind of insurance program would you like to have? And what would that cost you? What the costs are to these different plans. If you were in prison, you didn't have to pay that, and you'd have basically insurance because you'd get your medical care. How much do you pay in groceries a month? It'll probably make you mad if you think about it. If you multiply 30 times 70 and see how much it costs a month for us to keep somebody in there. And are you interested in somebody being locked up because they, were driving while revoked, driving without a license, or they were a 4-time shoplifter, and on the 4th time, it doesn't matter what the value is, it's a felony. And so they stole a pack of gum, and now they're sitting in prison, and you're paying for it. You're probably not going to be very happy as a taxpayer for that, and you're probably not scared of them. So we definitely, it's not hug a thug. We want people locked up that we're scared of, and people that need to pay for what they've done. But there are a large group of people that we could rehabilitate them in the communities.
Well, I sure appreciate your time tonight. I think we asked all the questions that were up on the board. Does anybody else have anything for Darren before we let him go? And I'll turn off the recording then. If anybody needs to stay on with me and talk about any other class issues, I'll stay on for a little bit. But any other questions for Darren? Job opportunities, Darren, or are they cutting officers these days?
No, we're still hiring officers. We are kind of reallocating those to different parts of the state based on our new supervision model. And with the ORAS, we have 4 different supervision levels. So low, moderate, high, and very high. And we've seen a shift as we've done this validated tool of where we have the highest, number of high-risk offenders and moderate and low-risk offenders based on those differences in sentencing and the crime rates in different areas and who they put on probation. So we do have positions shifting to different areas where they're needed. A lot of the rural areas are more in need now of officers than our urban areas. So we have a shift as we have vacancies. But Missouri Department of Corrections has never laid off a probation and parole officer before. And so we definitely need more of you. We're making a shift to more unit supervisors. So we have smaller units, so our supervisors can remain out in the community with our officers. There's really a big push to get us out in the community. We want to be where the offenders are at. And so if you go on our website and take a look, you'll see, kind of a shift now. Our officers have had the option to carry weapons for years, since '98, but now they're issued bulletproof vests and they're out in the community. So our officers are only in the office 1 day a week. Otherwise, they work from home a little bit, but mostly out in the community, meeting offenders where they're at. We don't want clients taking off work to come see us. We want them being at their job so we can catch them on a break. We can catch them on a weekend or night. We just want to be successful. So we're starting to get a lot more tools in place to be able to do that, which is awesome. But yeah, check out Missouri. I'm going to put my email here in the chat.
Yep.
If you have any questions afterwards.
I'm going to send them your email, and I'm also going to send them links on these various programs that you've talked about. And
Awesome.
If you can think of any that afterwards it might be good, just go ahead and email me. Either email address, Darren, will be good. I'll compile something for them so they can, if they're interested in this topic or in this as a job, I'll get the DOC jobs career website to them.
Absolutely. Awesome.
All right, man. I sure appreciate it. Thanks for giving us this much time tonight.
Hey, no problem. Good to see you all. Have a good evening.
Thanks a lot.
Talk to you later, Randy.